For more than 10 years, her life had followed the same quiet pattern, marked not by milestones but by routes. Yellow paint, black lettering, wide mirrors, and the steady vibration of a large engine beneath her feet defined most of her days. She was 44 years old, a black woman who had spent over a decade driving a yellow American school bus, carrying children through the predictable geometry of mornings and afternoons. The work was not glamorous, and it was rarely noticed, but it demanded presence. Every turn mattered. Every stop carried responsibility. She had learned early that routine was not monotony, it was protection. She lived with her family in a modest home that reflected the way she lived her life. Practical, careful, and without excess. The house was clean but small, filled with things that had been used for years and repaired instead of replaced. Money had never been plentiful, so she learned to respect it early. Groceries were planned down to the last item. Clothes were chosen for durability, not trend. Nothing was wasted unless it truly had no more use. There was pride in that discipline, even when it felt heavy. She did not complain about it out loud, but the weight of constant calculation lived quietly in her shoulders and followed her into sleep. Driving the school bus had never been just a job to her. She had chosen it because she loved children in a way that felt natural and steady, not performative. Over the years, she learned their habits, their moods, their silences. She noticed who sat alone and who always talked too loudly. She learned which children needed reminders and which ones needed reassurance. Parents trusted her without ever really thinking about it, handing over their children every morning with the unspoken belief that she would bring them back safely. That trust mattered to her more than a higher paycheck ever could. Still, love did not pay bills. As the years passed, the math of her life became tighter. Prices rose quietly, without permission. Utilities cost more. Food cost more. Unexpected expenses appeared more often than they used to, and each one left a mark. She managed it the only way she knew how, by absorbing the pressure without letting it spill outward. At night, when the house was quiet and the television was off, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone and a notebook, running the same numbers again and again, hoping that repetition might change the outcome. Lately, she had begun to think about change, even though the idea unsettled her deeply. Friends had suggested other jobs, better-paying work, different schedules, but every suggestion felt like it came with a cost she was not ready to pay. Leaving the bus meant leaving the children, the structure, the sense of purpose she had built carefully over a decade. It meant stepping into uncertainty at an age when uncertainty felt more dangerous than ever. And yet, the thought kept returning, uninvited, especially on nights when the numbers refused to balance. That afternoon had begun like any other. The bus filled with the familiar sounds of backpacks dropping, voices overlapping, laughter mixing with complaints about homework and snack. She drove with practiced calm, stopping where she always stopped, watching children climb down the steps and disappear toward their homes. Toward the end of the route, the scenery shifted subtly. Streets widened. Lawns stretched farther from the sidewalk. Houses grew larger, quieter, more private. This was one of the wealthier neighborhoods on her route, a place she passed through every day without ever feeling part of it. She dropped off the last few children with the same care she always did, waiting until they were safely on the sidewalk before closing the door. When the bus was finally empty, the silence felt heavier than usual. She rested her hands on the steering wheel for a moment, letting her shoulders drop. The shift was almost over. Soon she would return the bus to the depot, drive home, make dinner, and prepare herself to do it all again tomorrow. She guided the bus forward, following the familiar road toward the depot, her thoughts drifting toward the evening ahead and the quiet responsibilities waiting at home. That was when something interrupted the rhythm. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a shape that did not belong. Near the edge of the road, set slightly back from the traffic but still clearly visible, stood several cardboard boxes stacked together. They were large, clean, and oddly deliberate, wrapped tightly with yellow tape that caught the fading light. Not trash scattered carelessly, not a single box forgotten by accident, but a small cluster, placed with intention. She slowed the bus instinctively, her eyes lingering on them longer than necessary as she passed. She did not stop. Not yet. But as the bus rolled forward and the boxes slipped out of view in her mirrors, a quiet awareness settled in her chest. Something about them felt out of place, and for reasons she could not yet explain, she knew that when she thought back on this day, this moment would stand out from all the others. She continued toward the depot, unaware that this ordinary afternoon, this familiar road, had just placed the first marker on a path that was about to change far more than she expected. The bus was quieter on the way back to the depot, not because it was empty, but because her mind finally had space to wander. Without children behind her, without mirrors full of movement and noise, the road felt longer than usual. The engine hummed steadily beneath her, a familiar sound that normally calmed her nerves, yet this time it failed to settle her thoughts. The image of those boxes lingered in her mind with an insistence she could not explain. Clean cardboard, yellow tape, carefully stacked. They did not belong to the disorder of the street, and they certainly did not look like ordinary trash. She tried to dismiss it at first, telling herself that people left things out all the time. Moving, renovating, downsizing. Wealthy neighborhoods discarded objects that poorer ones would never consider throwing away. She had seen it before, though never this deliberately arranged. Still, she reminded herself that curiosity had limit. She was tired. She wanted to finish her shift, return the bus, go home, and settle into the predictable comfort of her evening routine. Stopping would mean delay. Stopping would mean questions, and questions lately felt heavier than answers. But as the bus rolled farther down the road, the feeling did not fade. Instead, it sharpened. She glanced at the clock mounted near the windshield. She was technically off duty now, the children delivered safely, the route completed. The depot was only minutes away, but the road curved back through the same stretch of neighborhood where she had seen the boxes. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as she approached the turn, her body responding before her mind fully caught up. The bus slowed again, almost without conscious decision, and this time she allowed it to. She pulled over carefully, engaging the hazard lights more out of habit than necessity. The street was empty. No pedestrians, no parked cars nearby. Just the quiet geometry of large houses set back from the road and the soft rustle of trees moving in the late afternoon air. For a moment she sat there, still inside the bus, listening to the engine idle. The yellow hood stretched out in front of her like a boundary she was hesitating to cross. She told herself she would only look. Stepping down from the bus felt strangely exposed, as if she were doing something far more dramatic than simply checking discarded boxes. Her boots hit the pavement with a dull thud, and she closed the bus door behind her, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet street. As she walked toward the boxes, she noticed again how intentional they appeared. 6 cardboard boxes, stacked neatly in 2 short columns, all sealed with the same yellow tape. The cardboard was dry and unwarped. No signs of weather damage. No ripped edges. This was not something that had sat here long. She crouched beside the first box and pressed lightly against the side. Solid. Heavy, but not impossibly so. The tape was still firmly attached, not peeled or torn. Her hesitation returned, sharper now. If someone had meant to retrieve these, would they really leave them like this? Out in the open? On the curb? Not even directly in front of a house? She glanced up and down the street again. Still no movement. Still no one watching. Carefully, she cut through the tape on the top box, folding back the cardboard flaps just enough to see inside. What she saw made her pause. Inside were neatly arranged snack boxes, still sealed and stacked with care. Bright packaging stood out against the dull brown cardboard. Chips, pastries, candy, things she recognized instantly from grocery aisles she walked every week. Nothing was crushed. Nothing was expired. It looked like someone had packed these intentionally, not thrown them away in frustration. A small, surprised breath escaped her before she could stop it. This was not junk. This was usable, practical, almost generous. She closed the flaps slowly, her mind racing now. One box like this could be a coincidence, a mistake. But 6? She moved to the second box, her movements quicker but still cautious, and opened it the same way. This time, the contents made her sit back on her heels. Inside were shoes, new shoes, still wrapped, arranged in pairs. Some were clearly adult sizes. Others were smaller, unmistakably meant for children. She recognized brands she had only seen through store windows or online ad. Athletic shoes. Clean soles. Crisp fabric. Nothing about them suggested disposal. Her heart began to beat faster, not from excitement alone, but from the sudden weight of possibility. She stood up slowly and looked around once more. The street remained empty. The houses remained silent. Whatever this was, it had been left behind intentionally, or abandoned without concern for what happened next. The distinction mattered less with every passing second. She made a decision then, one rooted not in greed, but in instinct. Leaving these boxes here felt wrong. Ignoring them felt worse. She returned to the bus and opened the storage compartment with practiced ease. One by one, she lifted the boxes inside, working carefully to avoid damage or noise. The bus, built to carry children, swallowed the boxes without complaint. As she loaded the last one, she noticed there were still 3 boxes she had not opened. Their weight varied. One felt lighter, another noticeably heavier. Her curiosity burned, but she resisted the urge to tear into everything right there on the street. She closed the compartment and leaned briefly against the side of the bus, steadying herself. This was no longer a quick look. This was something else entirely. As she climbed back into the driver's seat and turned off the hazard lights, a thought surfaced that sent a quiet thrill through her chest. If the first 2 boxes held things like this, what could possibly be inside the others? She pulled back onto the road, the bus heavier now, not just with boxes, but with unanswered questions, and headed toward home, knowing that whatever waited inside those remaining boxes was about to change the meaning of this ordinary day. And she had no idea just how far that change would reach. The bus rolled into the depot later than usual, and for the first time in years, she felt strangely disconnected from the routine she knew by heart. She parked carefully, completed the same closing steps she had repeated thousands of times, and yet her attention kept drifting back to the cargo now hidden inside the bus. The boxes were quiet, motionless, but they carried a presence that followed her through every familiar action. When she finally locked the bus and stepped away, it felt as if she were leaving part of herself behind, even though she knew she would return for them within minutes. Driving home that evening felt different. The road she had taken countless times now seemed shorter, tighter, as if the distance between one moment and the next had narrowed. She glanced at the rearview mirror more often than necessary, half expecting something to shift, to reveal itself prematurely. But the boxes remained unseen, sealed in the back of the vehicle she used for personal errands, waiting for the privacy of her driveway and the quiet of her home. Her house greeted her with the same modest familiarity it always had. A small yard, a porch that needed repainting, lights already on inside because her son was home from school. The normality of it all felt almost unreal compared to what she carried with her. She unloaded the boxes one by one, muscles tightening with each lift, arranging them carefully in the garage rather than dragging them inside immediately. She wanted space, control, a moment to breathe before curiosity took over completely. Only after dinner, after homework was done and her son retreated to his room, did she return to the garage. The air inside smelled faintly of oil and old cardboard, and the overhead light cast a single harsh shadow across the concrete floor. She sat down on a low stool, hands resting on her knees, studying the remaining unopened boxes as if they might speak first. This was the point of no return. Once opened, there would be no pretending she had not seen what was inside. She chose the next box almost at random. The tape peeled back easily, and when she folded open the flaps, she froze. Inside lay clothing, new, unworn, carefully folded. Athletic outfits, jackets, hoodies, pants, socks still bound together in original packaging. Some were clearly adult-sized, others unmistakably meant for teenagers. She ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling the weight, the quality. This was not clearance clothing. This was the kind of apparel she had passed by countless times, telling herself it was unnecessary, out of reach. Seeing it now, sitting on her garage floor, felt surreal. She closed that box and moved on, her heart beating faster now, the calm she had maintained earlier beginning to crack. The next box changed everything. Inside, cushioned by protective foam and bubble wrap, were electronic. A camera first, professional-looking, heavier than expected. Then another device, smaller but equally deliberate in its packaging. A laptop followed, sleek and intact, its surface unmarked, charger neatly coiled beside it. She stared at the contents, her mind struggling to keep pace with what her eyes were confirming. This was not a lucky find. This was not a forgotten snack box or an unwanted pair of shoes. This was expensive. Valuable. The kind of valuable that made her suddenly aware of the legal and moral weight pressing down on her chest. Her thoughts began racing ahead, faster than she could organize them. Who would throw this away? Why would anyone leave equipment like this on the side of the road? Was it a mistake? A rushed move? Something darker? She closed the box slowly, her excitement tempered now by unease. The responsibility of the find was settling in, heavier than the boxes themselves. She stood up and paced the garage, hands clasped tightly together. For a moment, she considered packing everything back up and returning it to the street where she found it, pretending the entire encounter had never happened. But logic pushed back. The boxes had not been marked. No names. No addresses. No signs indicating they belonged to anyone nearby. Returning them would not restore order. It would only return them to uncertainty. She opened the fifth box next, needing answers more than restraint at this point. Inside were accessories, bags, small cases, items wrapped individually. A designer handbag caught her eye immediately, its stitching flawless, hardware gleaming even under harsh light. She knew enough to recognize quality, even if she had never owned anything like it herself. The realization was unavoidable now. The combined value of what she had found far exceeded anything she could casually ignore. At this point in the story, many people would already be thinking about profit, but she wasn't there yet. What she felt instead was fear. Fear of making the wrong decision, fear of consequences she did not understand, fear of explaining any of this if questions were asked. She thought of her years driving children safely to and from school, of the trust placed in her daily, of the quiet pride she carried in doing her job well. Whatever she did next had to align with that person, not undermine her. Still, practicality crept in. Her son needed things. The household needed relief. She had been counting every dollar for years, choosing between wants and necessities with painful regularity. The item she had found could change that equation, not permanently perhaps, but enough to breathe again. Enough to step out of constant worry. The thought unsettled her, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt too easy. She sat back down and took out her phone, not to sell anything yet, but to understand. She searched brands, models, rough values. Each result added another layer of disbelief. These were not minor finds. These were items people insured, protected, worried about losing. And yet here they were, sealed in cardboard, abandoned without explanation. At this moment, she paused, long enough to notice how quiet the house was, how steady her breathing had become despite the storm of thoughts inside her head. If this story were shared later, she knew this would be the moment people leaned forward, wondering what choice she would make next. She closed the last unopened box without looking inside. Some answers could wait. What mattered now was deciding whether she was simply the finder of these things, or the beginning of something far more complicated. And as she turned off the garage light and walked back inside, one question followed her closely into the dark. Had she just stumbled into a blessing, or into a problem she didn't yet understand? She barely slept that night. Not because of excitement but because of responsibility. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind returned to the same images. Sealed boxes, untouched electronics, clothing that still smelled faintly of factory plastic, and the unanswered question of how all of it ended up on a quiet residential street. By morning, the discovery no longer felt like luck. It felt like something she had to manage carefully, without attracting attention or making mistakes she could not undo. The next day moved slowly, deliberately. She followed her usual routine, preparing breakfast, reminding her son about schoolwork, driving him where he needed to go. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, every ordinary action carried a new layer of tension. She listened more closely to conversations around her, paid attention to police cars passing by, watched neighborhood movements with heightened awareness. It wasn't paranoia so much as instinct, the instinct of someone who understood that sudden change required caution. When the house was finally quiet again, she returned to the garage with a notebook and her phone. This time, she approached the boxes with intention rather than curiosity. One by one, she opened them again, cataloging what she saw. Brands, conditions, serial numbers where visible. She took photos, not to sell yet, but to understand. She needed to know exactly what she was dealing with before taking a single step forward. She researched carefully, avoiding anything that felt rushed or suspicious. She learned how quickly electronics depreciated, how designer items retained value if kept in pristine condition, how resale worked legally through verified platforms. She also learned how often storage units were abandoned after months of unpaid rent, their contents cleared out in bulk by third parties who had no interest in sorting value from clutter. That detail mattered. It gave the situation a shape that was no longer mysterious or criminal, just unfortunate and impersonal. Still, doubt lingered. She checked missing item listings, local notices, community boards. Nothing matched what she had found. No one was searching for lost boxes. No alerts described stolen electronics or missing collections. The absence of claims did not erase her unease, but it softened it. Slowly, the narrative shifted from fear to responsibility. These items had been discarded, left behind, forgotten. If they were to have a future, she would have to give them one. Her first decision was cautious and symbolic rather than profitable. She chose a single item, one piece of electronics, and brought it to a reputable resale shop across town. Not a pawn shop known for cutting corners, but a clean, established store that required documentation and transparency. She watched carefully as the clerk inspected the item, tested it, verified its condition. No alarm, no suspicion, just a standard evaluation followed by a fair offer. She declined the sale. Not because the offer was bad, but because she needed confirmation before commitment. The ease of the interaction told her something important. This was not dangerous territory. This was commerce. Controlled. Legal. Predictable. The realization steadied her more than any reassurance could have. Over the next few days, she moved with restraint. One item at a time. One platform at a time. She sold a camera first, then another piece of equipment, spacing transactions to avoid attention and burnout. Each sale was documented. Each payment traceable. She did not touch the money immediately, letting it sit where it landed, as if testing whether it was real enough to stay. Her son noticed the change before she explained it. New shoes appeared without the usual hesitation. Groceries included items she normally skipped. The house felt lighter, not because it was suddenly wealthy, but because the pressure had eased just enough to allow breathing room. When she finally told him that she had found some things and sold them, she kept the explanation simple. No drama. No mystery. Just honesty without burden. Emotionally, she found herself confronting something unexpected. For years, she had defined herself by service, driving children safely, putting family first, sacrificing quietly. Now, she was forced to see herself as someone capable of recognizing opportunity, of acting decisively without betraying her values. That shift was unsettling, but also empowering. She was not waiting anymore. She was choosing. Still, not everything was resolved. There were items she hadn't touched yet. A laptop she considered keeping. A designer bag she wasn't sure how to price. And one sealed container she had deliberately avoided opening again, because it felt different. Heavier, more personal, more final. She knew that box would demand a different kind of decision. By the end of the week, her debts looked smaller on paper. Bills once juggled now lined up with clearer outcomes. She had not escaped her life, but she had changed its direction. And yet, she sensed this was not the end of the story. Some finds opened doors. Others opened questions. And the one box she still hadn't opened was quietly waiting to decide which kind this would be. The final box stayed in the garage longer than she intended. Days passed with it pushed slightly to the side, as if it belonged to a different timeline than the rest of the discoveries. Everything else had already been dealt with in ways that felt practical and controlled. The electronics were tested, cleaned, documented, and sold carefully through legitimate channels. The clothing had been sorted with the same discipline she applied to everything in her life. What fit her family stayed, what didn't was passed on or sold modestly. Money from those sales was tracked, not celebrated. Every dollar was given a purpose before it was allowed to exist as relief. But that last box felt heavier than its size suggested. Not physically, emotionally. It carried the sense that it was not meant to be opened casually. It wasn't marked with logos or brand tape. It wasn't damaged or hastily sealed. It had been closed with care, reinforced at the edges, stacked as if someone expected to return for it one day. That detail stayed with her more than anything else. She finally opened it late one evening, when the house was quiet and the world felt slower. The garage light hummed softly overhead, casting a pale glow that made shadows stretch across the concrete floor. She pulled the box toward her and sat down, not rushing, not bracing herself for surprise, just allowing the moment to exist. Inside, there was no spectacle, no immediate shock. Only a small metal safe and a neatly wrapped folder placed beside it, aligned carefully as if orders still mattered to whoever packed them. The folder came first. Inside were documents arranged chronologically, protected from moisture and dust. Storage rental agreement. Notices of late payment. Official letters marked with dates that had passed quietly without response. The same name appeared again and again. There was nothing alarming in the paperwork. No police stamps, no warnings of seizure beyond what had already occurred. It told a simple story in administrative language. A person had rented space, stopped paying, and disappeared from the system without explanation. The facility had followed protocol. Time had passed. Ownership had transferred. The absence of drama unsettled her more than evidence of wrongdoing would have. There was no villain here. Just silence. The safe was next. She hesitated before opening it, not because she feared legal consequences, she had already done her due diligence, but because it felt intrusive, like crossing into the last private space of someone who could no longer defend it. When she finally turned the latch, it opened easily. Inside were neatly bundled bills and a few personal items that carried no obvious market value but radiated meaning. A watch with signs of wear. A ring stored separately, wrapped in cloth. No engraving she could see. No note. Just objects that had once been important enough to protect. She closed the safe and sat back, letting the quiet fill the space between thoughts. This was the moment she had been preparing herself for since the first box had been opened days earlier. Everything before this had been logistics. This was ethics. Over the following week, she moved deliberately. She confirmed every detail again, not because she doubted the outcome, but because she needed certainty to live with the decision. She contacted the storage facility through official channels, asking careful questions without revealing unnecessary information. She documented abandonment timelines. She read state guidelines. Each answer aligned with the last. There was no claim pending, no appeal, no missing person report attached to the name. Whatever had happened, the trail had ended legally and cleanly. That knowledge didn't erase the weight, but it made it manageable. She did not spend the cash immediately. She deposited it, waited, and then began applying it with the same discipline that had defined her life long before this moment. Overdue balances were paid in full. Utility accounts were stabilized. Credit cards that had hovered just below their limits were cleared methodically, one at a time. With every confirmation email, something loosened inside her. Not excitement, not joy. Relief. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself, but stays. For the first time in years, there was space between problems. The watch and ring stayed with her longer. She had them appraised, learned their value, and then placed them back in storage. They weren't emergency solutions. They were options. Knowing they existed without needing to act on them immediately was a new feeling, one she allowed herself to experience without guilt. Life didn't transform into something unrecognizable. She still woke early. Still drove the same yellow school bus along familiar route. Still greeted the same children, remembered their habits, noticed who needed encouragement and who needed calm. Her job remained the same, and she didn't resent that. If anything, she felt more anchored in it now. The work had always mattered to her. What had drained her was the fear that it would never be enough. That fear receded. Her son noticed the change before she did. It showed in the way she listened without distraction, in the way evenings felt less tense, in the way plans were discussed without whispered calculations. When she gave him the laptop, one of the items she had chosen to keep, his reaction wasn't loud. It was still. He understood, even at his age, that this wasn't just a gift. It was trust in the future. She didn't tell many people what had happened. The story didn't need an audience. It wasn't about luck, and it wasn't something she wanted to repeat. This was not a new identity. It was a moment, one that demanded responsibility rather than celebration. Over time, the remaining items found their places. Some were sold thoughtfully. Some were donated. Some were simply let go. The garage returned to being a garage. The boxes disappeared, leaving no visible trace of what had passed through that space. Months later, she drove past the same road where the boxes had first appeared. The curb was empty. The street looked ordinary, untouched by significance. She didn't slow down. That chapter didn't need revisiting. What stayed with her wasn't the money, or the objects, or even the relief they had brought. It was the understanding that survival didn't always look like struggle. Sometimes it looked like patience. Sometimes it looked like restraint. And sometimes it arrived quietly, wrapped in ordinary cardboard, asking only one thing in return: to be handled with care. The bus moved steadily forward through the afternoon light, children talking softly behind her. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't calculating what might go wrong next. She was simply present. And that, more than anything she had found, was what truly changed her life.